Guten Morgen, herzlich willkommen.
Good morning to all of you. Warm welcome. My name is Lena Luig, and I'm the head of the Department of International Agricultural Policy. And I have the honor to welcome you to this very interesting event today about the trade treaty between Mercosur and EU, consequences for agriculture, forests, and climate. And I'm delighted that we are hosting this event from the EU offices of Martin Häusling and Anna Cavazzini. And for the introductory words, I would like to hand over to both of them. Just briefly about the agenda of today, we have separated the discussion into parts. The panel that will be moderated by Anna Cavazzini herself will be talking about trade and forest protection. And then secondly, we talk about the consequences on the trade treaty on agriculture, forests and climate. This is where I will going to be moderating. Just a technical housekeeping remark. So if you are not sufficiently German proficient, then please grab a headphone. Or if you do not speak English, then same applies, because we will be listening to two videos in English language. And with that, I would like to hand over to Martin Häusling, member of the European Parliament and agricultural policy spokesman of the Greens and EFA Group, and Anna Cavazzini, who's chairwoman of Internal Market and Consumer Protection. So I'm the one to start out. Good morning, and thank you so much for joining us so numerously here today for this very important event. And we are not really lacking important issues these days, but I do think that the Mercosur agreement is one of those issues that is accompanying us for quite some time, maybe in the European Parliament and as well in the German Federal Parliament. We are quite closely connected to Latin America. I've visited Chile several times with a delegation, Argentina and Brazil, and I do think that I've seen a bit of the continent, and we have, of course, a different situation as compared to just last year. When we talked about the issue last year, Bolsonaro was still the president of Brazil, and of course, it was really not an option to conclude any agreements with Bolsonaro. Now we are quite hopeful with Lula being the new president of Brazil, but there are quite some numerous stories that are quite irritating, to put it mildly, because Lula is, of course, not the only one making the rules. So the situation in Brazil is quite difficult, and the same applies to Argentina and the other two countries, Uruguay and Paraguay. And this is something that we will at least try to cover in a panel that is quite comprehensive. And in the end, I hope we will have achieved more clarity, more knowledge. Is it really worthwhile thinking about concluding the contract for the EU and for Latin America, or are there risks that we still need to discuss? So I hope that we will be able to listen to some fruitful discussions, and I will hand over to Anna Cavazzini. Thank you so much, Martin. As well from my side, warm welcome here in the Heinrich-Böll Foundation. Thank you so much for the foundation to host the event. My name is Anna Cavazzini, and I am a member of Parliament for the Greens, like Martin, and I am part of the Internal Market and Consumer Protection, and have negotiated the rules on supply chains that are not damaging the forest. So we've done a lot in the last years, and Martin and myself, we have fought hard. We have an anti-deforestation plan, and then we try to ban products that come from forced labor. And Franziska Brandner is just entering the room, and we are now exiting the very damaging energy contract. And I think we have achieved quite some successes. And under Bolsonaro, we were able to put this agreement in the fridge, so to say, to freeze the negotiations. Now the situation has changed. We have Lula now heading the country, and I've just visited Brazil with an official delegation of the EU Commission. But we will now see to how we consider the contents of the treaty, what can be changed, what can be improved. All those big issues that we, of course, are dealing with is forest protection, agricultural exports. For many years, we have warned and drawn the attention to more exports from Brazil, of course, will raise the pressure on the Amazon forest and on those arable land tenures. And this is why we would like to focus on the agricultural policy, forest protection, and I'm really looking forward to this event. Thank you so much for coming. And with that, I would like to ask our first panelist to the stage. And Martin, goodbye to you for the moment. And we will have Franziska Brettner with us. I've seen her already. She's in the back of the room. She's our parliamentarian state secretary at the Federal Ministry of Economics, Carlos Rittel, and Mr. Holterhus. Big hand of applause for all of you. Nice. So, and before we kick off the discussion that will be open to the audience, we will like to show you a video of another Brazilian guest. Of course, it's important that we don't only talk amongst ourselves here in the European Union, but of course, it's very important to give those actors on the ground a voice. And Márcio Astrini will be joining us. He is Secretary General of the biggest climate-oriented NGO, the Observatório do Clima Brasil. That's why we would like to share this video for you. For all those who do not speak English, please grab a headphone.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for this invitation to be here with you today remotely. Thank you, Ana Cavazzini, for inviting me. And I'd like in a few words to introduce what's happening in the Brazilian political and social environmental scenario, what's going on there, and how it can influence in the EU-Mercosur trade deal. First of all, I'd like to use one special day that happened in Brazil 10 days ago about an Environmental World Day. There we had Lula, our president, launching the anti-deforestation law, anti-deforestation plan in the country. It was a very special moment because exactly we had our president showing in public he is committed to fight against deforestation. He was there launching a plan against deforestation, and he was there launching this plan aside some ministries very important, aside the indigenous minister, for instance, which was created in the beginning of this government. Marina Silva was there in the Environmental Day, of course, launching the same plan with Lula. That's a huge difference in comparison to the last government. But look, if in this day Lula was there launching one anti-deforestation plan to the country, the other side of the street, the Congress was planning a launch or to approve a set of setbacks, a series of setbacks to exactly do the opposite, to increase deforestation. So if the government is committed to halt the forest loss in Brazil, the Congress is committed to destroy the forests in Brazil and to give benefits to the criminals. So that's exactly what is happening in the country. Lula's election is not enough to guarantee our agenda will not face a lot of setbacks in the next time. So we still need pay attention what's happening in Brazil, and we still need international support to avoid this kind of regress. At the same time, we are right now discussing the EU-Mercosur trade deal. And I would like to highlight at least two contradictions that brings a huge concernment over this trade deal. The first one is about exactly the setbacks being approved in the Congress. How exactly the trade deal could help Brazil or could help us, environmental defenders, to avoid this kind of setbacks? A lot of people are saying this trade deal should bring guarantees against setbacks in the legislation to ensure a better protection for the forest. But in this real case, how this trade deal could help to avoid this kind of setbacks, specifically in the indigenous rights? Another contradiction is exactly related to the EU-Mercosur anti-deforestation regulation approved recently in EU Parliament. This is one recognition that there is a problem in Brazil that needs to be controlled. If this problem needs to be controlled, how we will push ahead one commerce or one deal, including sectors like cattle sectors, if we still don't control the problem caused by this market? So this kind of contradictions, this kind of situation cannot be answered by those who are right now defending the trade deal, and it's a really big concernment. We need to pay attention and we need to discuss more. So I am ending from here, and thank you very much for this opportunity. Again, thank you very much for the invitation.
Danke.
Thank you so much, Marcio. Remotely, he's joining us, and he is one of the representatives of the biggest climate-oriented NGOs, and we see that there's a lot of criticism when we look towards the treaty. Franziska, our parliamentarian state secretary at the Federal Ministry of Economics and Climate Protection. So to you, how is the federal government regarding or perceiving this treaty? So what's the strategy when it comes to this treaty, or forest protection in Brazil, Argentina, and other countries neighboring the Amazon region? Good morning. Thank you so much for the invitation. I think it is important, the way we've just heard, to look that there is a president at the head of the country that is committed to protecting the Amazon forest. And this is a very special situation that we've not seen in the last years. And therefore, it can only be our goal to how we can support him in his endeavors. This is our main objective because, as he rightly said, Marcio, of course, he does not really have this majority in the Congress. And this is why the situation is not really an easy one in Brazil. We have a battle, an ongoing fight between Lula and the Congress of how we can achieve a sustainable use of the Amazon forest. I mean, it's not really a solution to say nobody may live in it or may make use of the ground, but how can we do it sustainably? And the question is of how this treaty can contribute to, facilitating the sustainable use of the Amazon forest. And at the same time, of course, we do have our virgin forests in Europe, primary forests here in Europe, and Brazil says, okay, if we talk about virgin forests, what happens to your forests back in Europe? And this is, of course, quite correct when they say so. It always has to be a mutual understanding. So we have to look at our primary forests still existing in our countries and how we can protect them. If this is clear as a goal, then, of course, we have to look into how trade can support those goals that we're committed to here in Europe and Lula's committed to in Brazil. And then, of course, we have to look at the status quo and what can improve or deteriorate by the treaty. Our current situation is that there is no export tariffs on soy, and Brazil does not have those tariffs, so for soy, nothing really changes when the treaty enters into force. So this is the status quo. So everything that we can achieve in Mercosur in terms of the forest protection will improve the status quo. If we don't do anything, then soy will remain being in a better situation than those sustainable products from the rainforest. So we do have the possibility to achieve, together with the EU-Mercosur treaty, that acerola, like those sustainable products from the rainforest, have a priority situation when entering our market. We have a lot of sugar products. 10, 15 years ago, I think Germany did not want to treat them preferentially, and now we have to think about how serious we are about it and how we can achieve it. The status quo is that he rightly said that we have an unilateral instrument, the deforestation law, that unilaterally describes that up till when products may not enter the market. And this is an approach that the Brazilian government and other governments are not really happy about. So the question is of how we can turn this instrument into a bilateral instrument by talking about it. So if we say we have this common goal, so let's see if how we can adjust it together. I think this is what we are looking into with the goal to achieve something jointly, a mutual approach. And then we have the internal EU debate. That's not an easy one. And France, of course, is a very central actor. France is in the center of attention when it comes to import of meat. And it's true that the amount of meat entering our markets from Mercosur would not destroy our markets, but France is always referring to have several treaties are worked into in parallel, Mexico, Australia maybe, and then Mercosur. And it's only covering just a little of meat, but the sum of it, of course, changes the market. It's not really wrong. You may not only look at the individual treaty, but that's not true. I mean, you cannot tell Mercosur you cannot have any of it because New Zealand covered it all. So it's not a very simple situation where we have to look at having all the sides, having a compromise. We have to push Mercosur further because I think we can all benefit from it and are interested in supporting President Lula.
I've got a follow-up question because the green criticism, which also came from the civil society recently, is that additional agro exports increase the pressure on deforestation in Brazil and the Mercosur countries. What's your take on that, and what are the improvements that you are striving for as a federal government? Well, I already said when it comes to soy, there would be no changes, basically. So we can only hope that our improvements can improve the status quo, so there cannot be any deterioration at all. And when it comes to the direct meat imports, as I said, so the share that's coming from Mercosur is quite little, basically. So compared to the exports to China, that's what they achieve in 6 days. So, of course, we now have to try to find out how to deal with the overall picture. So now we have the first one with New Zealand, and we cannot punish the Mercosur for that. This would be a strange logic. So we have to find a good solution. The Mercosur is such... I mean, they say that the farmers are actually on the losing end. And what we want to achieve is forest protection on both sides, the EU and Mercosur, so that trade can make a contribution so that we have a sustainable utilization of the forests. Well, we can now look at how such a sustainable foresting can look like. But now I would like to turn to the Brazilian debate, and I'm quite happy about our Brazilian guest, Carlos Riddle. He's a well-known sustainability expert. He's been a research fellow at the ISS in Potsdam, the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies or Science. And before that, he also worked at the Climate Observatory in Brazil. And I would like to know now how the debate in Brazil looks like on the treaty in civil society, but also within the government. And how do you look at this treaty? What's your take on that?
Good morning, everyone. My apologies, I will be speaking in English. Okay. And so thank you very much, Martin and Heinrich-Böll, for the invitation. I'm very glad to be here. I came here as a fellow of the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies to study exactly the trade agreement between European Union and Mercosur, which conditions would hold Brazil accountable to the sustainability standards or the chapter on trade and sustainable development. And my conclusion, and I was working together with other researchers, it was that considering the standards, the current standards, the way it is, and the lack of enforcement of that chapter, nothing would prevent setbacks, could prevent setbacks. And so we could see, in spite of the fact that the trade agreement was launched with a series of information, including some fact sheets saying that no setbacks would be allowed on forest protection, indigenous people's rights, labor rights. What we see, and Marcia was very clear about that, at the same time that we have the willingness of many members of Brazilian government, including Lula himself, to see the agreement to come into force, we have this a huge risk of setbacks that haven't finished after Lula's election. And so the debate right now is, well, we also have seen this so-called side letter from the trade agreement, or the joint statement, or the draft joint statement that would, in theory, reinforce the environmental commitments by all signatories. But the conclusion that we have, it reinforces some of the same of the commitments that are already in the trade agreement, but it's toothless. It doesn't add any enforcement. And so while right now President Lula and some of his ministers are saying, oh, this put an additional burden over our shoulders, and in fact reinforces most of the expected deliverables for any countries, like implementation of Paris Agreement and the protection of forests or protection of indigenous people's rights, but doesn't the fulfillment of ILO conventions, and but nothing more than that. And so what happens is that those who have been studying this agreement, I include myself among them, understands that there is no progress on the environmental enforcement, or the enforcement of the environmental standards of the agreement as it is. And if the agreement addresses only legality, what is now considered a crime, for example, the invasion of indigenous lands or indigenous territories by illegal miners, illegal loggers, can be turned legal afftivity. And so this is one of the risks that we are running right now. It's one of the bills that affects the demarcation of indigenous lands, adds additional risks and threats over indigenous peoples and their territories. For example, allowing those lands to be undemarcated, if this word exists. And so the territories that have been already recognized, and the constitutional rights of indigenous people have been already recognized, could be reversed in the case of someone says that there are changes in cultural tracts of indigenous people. And so this is a risk. A series of high-impact activities could, if this draft law is approved, it has been approved by the lower houses and sent to the Senate. If it's approved by the Senate, what would happen is that a lot of the risks would be, and the threats over indigenous peoples and their territories would be legalized. And so if the trade agreement doesn't address this properly on the conversations among the two blocs, but including Germany and EU and other countries, and Brazil, the biggest player in the Mercosur, I'm afraid that we'll be having still narrative battle, while on the ground what is going to happen will be the same that we are seeing now. Lula's government came into power, and we don't know what will happen by the end of the next elections. And he came into power with a series of commitments, and he has appointed Marina Silva, he has appointed Minister Sônia Guajajara. For the first time, we have a ministry address on indigenous people's affairs, but this won't last long. And the balance of forces on the ground right now are different from the ones that Lula met when he came into power in 2003. We have organized crime much more tied with the environmental crimes. And the National Congress is the same. Lula was elected and just went. Lula was elected in 2003 with a strong support from his party. His party was one of the strongest in the National Congress. Right now, he has a very powerful opposition formed by groups, including the Rural Caucus, whose main interest is not food production, it's land market. They want land within indigenous territories, they want land in public lands, and so they want to legalize land grabbing, the invasion of public lands, because they are interested in a huge market of land in Brazil. And then we don't need further deforestation in the country in order to meet the national demands for food production and also the international demands. I think that there are ways to improve a lot the conversation on these environmental standards and the trade agreement.
Carlos,
I'm going to speak German now. I think you described it quite nicely. On the one hand, there's the Lula government, which is very much in line with the EU when it comes to forest protection and climate protection, but there's a Congress with a different majority and where currently very problematic bills are being passed. So when you talk to actors of the Brazilian government, then they do not want to strengthen forest protection in the agreement. Why is this so? Could you explain that? I mean, if they see that there are difficulties in the Congress, for example, they do not know who the next president will be, if Bolsonaro will come back one day. So why is the current government so against forest protection in the agreement?
This is a guess, but it's a guess based on what Lula has been saying. When he was elected and when he was in Sharm el-Sheikh during COP28, in his speech, he spoke about the trade agreement, but he also addressed not only the environmental side of it, but also the imbalance between the benefits that European corporations could get from its implementation. About 90% of the products exported by European Union to the Mercosur countries could benefit from tax exemptions if the trade agreement comes into force, while for Mercosur countries is mostly commodities, and so agricultural commodities. And so if it's already unbalanced, adding commitments for one block only might be not fair, while it's correct. In terms of if the agreement wants to deliver what it has promised, that would contribute to this sustainable development, it needs to be enforced. But I think there's this other side. Lula has mentioned this a couple of times, that the imbalance of the benefits that could be offered to corporations in the two blocks.
Yeah, thank you very much. Es wurde gerade schon angesprochen.
Well, it has just been mentioned there's this additional instrument, and maybe not every one of you knows it. So the Commission, the EU Commission, after there was a lot of criticism over the past 2 years, has 3 months ago submitted an additional instrument which includes sustainability criteria. And we, as the Greens, have always considered it very toothless and criticized it. So the Brazilian government rejected it outright because they said it's too much. But now I think it's quite interesting to hear a scientific perspective on this additional instrument. I'm quite happy that Mr. Holter, who is here, professor at the Leuphana University in Lüneburg, and currently you have drafted an expert opinion also for the Green Parliamentary group in order to assess this additional instrument. So what are your conclusions? Well, thank you very much for the invitation, first of all. In fact, I have drafted an expert opinion on the question in how far is forest protection implemented or can be implemented in the Mercosur agreement. And one aspect of this expert opinion actually is also the question whether the additional instrument of the EU is really useful. So just to give an overall view of the picture, what does scientific policy advice do, or what we do not do is to explain politics, what needs to be done. The political decision needs to be taken by the politicians eventually. But science can make a contribution. We can make an assessment on the German or EU constitutional foundation, in this case the EU, because it's responsible for the agreement with the Mercosur countries, and to discuss the guidelines that derive from the agreement. And the expert opinion comes to two conclusions, or looked at two things: whether there is any forest protection and how do we want to protect the forest. And it's quite relevant, and it's very often overlooked, that the European constitutional law, this is the law or the right of the constitutional or the European treaties, many people think that it determines the foreign policy of the EU when it comes to the targets. And for those who know about it, is Article 21, which explicitly says that there are specific targets that the EU needs to follow in its foreign policy, apart from the multilateralization of trade, which is another target of the EU. But part of it is also the sustainability aspect and also the protection of common goods, for example, large forests. So the question whether the European Union in the course of the negotiations is actually working towards incorporating sustainability aspects in its agreement is not as voluntary as some people might think at first sight. So it is a part of the union treaties which has been signed by the member states, so it needs to be done. However, the extent of which is, up for discussion. And on this basis, I looked at the possibilities to implement the forest protection. And now I'm coming back to your question: how's the status quo of the implementation, and how about the additional instrument? So the status quo is, and I have to say this very honestly, is not good for the protection of the forest. Of course, we could say that it's still better than what we see at the multilateral level or internationally, but it is basically nothing. And insofar, it's not very difficult to go beyond that. So it is a chapter which is not really strict in its standards when it comes to its obligations, material-wise, and moreover, when it comes to any dispute resolution, it's not really strict. But there are some statements, goodwill statements. From an international law perspective, it's basically nothing. And the debate that evolved around it was countered by the European Commission with this additional instrument. So the interpretation guideline, so to speak, which is from an international law point of view, this means that certain terms that come up in a treaty between two or more parties need to be outlined in a more specific way. And this is an instrument which can lead to an improvement. However, this instrument does not lead to an improvement. So it's quite surprising when the Mercosur states say, well, they think it's going too far already because there's nothing in it, basically. It's not meant as a mean comment. It might exactly what it is intended for, but it does not mean a substantial improvement for the protection of the forests, or when it comes to the concrete protective procedures, when it comes to violations against this regulation, is not being improved. So now we hear that there's supposed to be a new instrument that's being worked on. And of course, I have to say quite clearly that we are only discussing the leaked parts. So there's no official paper being made public by the EU. We just talk about the leaked parts. And I don't know whether this is the latest state. Things are happening here. But coming back to what I said in the beginning, there's no protection of the forest, no real protection of the forest, and the current instrument is not really amending the situation. So that much about the question referring to the status quo. And in your expert opinion, you are proposing concrete improvements, how such an additional instrument might look like. So maybe you can briefly say what you envision. Well, in fact, the expert opinion is based on the assumption to look at the existing potential without intensively looking or infringing on the existing text. So I set up two possible designs. One is adding a chapter without having to change the other chapters. So this would be an additional chapter which would refer to the protection of forests with concrete obligations. And I would like to enter the obligation to refrain from any damage to forests, and in addition, an obligation to protect the forests from illegal activities of third parties, especially private parties. This is already been implemented partially, but we need the effective implementation in the respective jurisdictions and a reporting obligation, which means that on a regular basis you would have to report on the improvements when it comes to forest protection. This would be the material aspect, and the procedural aspect would mean that these obligations that could also be implemented in a reciprocal way. I mean, we are not only talking about the Brazilian side, but also the protection of the remaining natural forests and primeval forests in Europe, and that any violations against these obligations would mean that the other side has the possibility to go to an international impartial court based on the rule of law, which can find a verdict, and based on this verdict, we can have an implementation. This means that certain advantages that were actually provided for by the agreement could be withdrawn. This would be one mechanism. And the other mechanism, as these dispute resolution mechanism was set up in a context, and of course the EU also has a colonial past, which is of course not positive or entirely negative, to put it differently, to create a mechanism which is not starting with conflict resolution, but to create an incentive for both sides to protect the rainforests. And I have created an incentive system which lays out that over a longer period of times, certain benefits can added on top of each other. So an independent Forest Protection Council could evaluate whether certain protection regulations have been complied with, and this would, for example, lower certain tariffs or increase funding, and this could continue over a longer period of time. But when it comes to violation, it might lead to withdrawing of all the benefits. So the background for this, and this brings me back to my previous speaker, this would mean that we may take precautions for worse times, for times that are not as good. For example, should we be faced with the Brazilian government one day which is not at all interested in protecting the rainforest, and should there be so many benefits that have piled up, even though the government has not an intrinsic interest in protecting the rainforest, but maybe an intrinsic interest in maintaining these benefits because it's very costly to lose all these benefits, that they would continue to protect the rainforest. Thank you very much. Very interesting. And for explaining your expert opinion. And it's very interesting to link trade alleviations to certain incentives. This is something that, of course, we also in the European Parliament have been discussing for quite a long time, but de facto this has not been implemented and no agreement. So, Franziska, what do you say about this expert opinion and the ideas? Do you think that it's politically feasible? I mean, this is what you would have to do in the Parliament eventually, because via the Commission and the Council and the Trade Policy Committee in the European context, you are involved in that. So how do you think about the political feasibility?
Herr Holthus, Sie haben gerade gesagt, das ist etwas komplett Neues.
Mr. Holthus, you were just saying that this is something completely new. It's not really that new because we have our trade agreements that have, if you don't abide by the rules, then it does have some consequences. And then it depends on whose side for and how strong. And we have those least developed countries with trade consequences. So this is not completely new. And then we have a standard that is the way it is when it comes to trade facilitations, and then we can go away from that. Or we say it's the status, and if you abide by the rules, then you will receive more. So it ends up being more or less the same. So it depends on how we negotiate it. And my impression is that we have to be aware that we don't help Lula now, but say, maybe 5 years down the line, we can help you if you are able to push through your policy. But we would like to support him right now, supporting him to protect the rainforest. So this is like a pondering of the different benefits and disadvantages. So what's better? So is it something that we can negotiate now? So if you're willing to accept those criteria, then of course you can benefit from them right now, because we have an interest of protecting the rainforest right now and not a few years down the line. But if we're not able to do it now, then of course we can do it in order to have an adjustment along the way. So I think it's important and quite clear that we, from our European side, we have to help, financially speaking, with the forest protection. This, of course, is a claim from the civil society and from Brazil to say, okay, if you want that, so help us with more funding. And since you said before that we have an interest, a Brazilian interest that meets European interest, I would place it way around. So the inherent interest of Lula and his team is to protect the rainforest, and maybe we have an interest in it as well, but it's not we have an interest, and Lula has to do, but he is the one wanting to do that, and we would like to support him. So the question is of how we can best do it, and this is a different approach to the additional instrument, the way we have it right now. So we would like to support the endeavors financially and with our trade instruments. I said before, there are different products from the sustainable rainforest use that do not have a preferential treatment, which is absurd. So soy can enter the country tariff-free, and many other derivatives from sugar may not enter the market. So this is really difficult to explain to people. So if we destroy the rainforest and plant soy, you can enter with low tariffs or non-tariffs, and other products that would save the rainforest cannot enter the market. So, of course, he wants to have trade facilitation for those products that are sustainable. But, of course, we have to consider that when the Brazilian side says that it is unequal or an unbalanced situation, that we would like to export more, then it is about cattle, it is about beef, and it's about quota. And this is exactly this part where France has never ever. And then we have the second part, which is about resources, raw materials, where Brazil says we don't simply want to exploit our raw materials and export them, we want to further process them in our country. And this is, of course, is right. So we have to see how the treaty can make a contribution of how value can stay within the country. We have more value creation in the country. And this, of course, is important to Brazil. So I think we have an interest in having further processing of the raw materials in the countries of origin. Brazil is one of them, and to see how we can bring this together. And sometimes it's not really an easy discussion within the EU and within the Mercosur states, maybe not, or even not within Brazil. So this is the way it works in democratic states. It's not always easy to find the right majorities, but I'm quite hopeful that we were able to do that. And then we have this unilateral forest protection instrument, which is quite effective. So in the end, we do have this instrument, but it's, of course, only second best, because it would be nicer to have something that we draw in together. Yeah, with the unilateral instruments, the problem is that El Cerrado no is not part of it. So it is in the review clause, so we hope that it will be entered. in the agreement. Carlos Rittl, you said, and Franziska Brandner took it up again, that the Lula administration has certain imbalances that were criticized. And we're right now in a situation, the Commission has sent the instrument, and now the Mercosur states would like to come together to find the right response. And when I travel to Brazil, I've perceived that we're talking about exemptions when it is to intellectual property, when it comes to health issues. Brazil has made very bad experiences throughout the pandemic. And how could we balance those imbalances with the treaty? What do we expect the Mercosur states to propose?
I really don't know what to expect from the countries. The letter has been sent 3 months ago. There's no clear statement rather than the reaction that this is additional burden over Mercosur countries. And so we don't know yet how this will evolve. But however, I think that's one point that it should have been addressed better. It was the consultation for this new additional instrument. For the negotiation of the trade agreement, there was this sustainability impact assessment. It was not good in the contact with the Brazilian stakeholders. I was working for the Brazilian Climate Observatory, being invited several times to go to Brasilia for briefings with politicians, including from the EU, at the EU Embassy, including during the election. However, I was never asked to indicate members of the climate observatories that should speak with the experts that developed the sustainability impact assessment. However, we had a significant contribution from different NGOs and also from indigenous people. They travel to Europe to speak with politicians here in Germany, in Brussels, and everywhere about the risks of the implementation of the trade agreement. Why they haven't been heard now during the discussions about this additional instrument. I think this is still very important. I don't know what will be the next steps on the negotiations after the response from the Mercosur countries. I think it would be even the criticism would be reduced if there would be consultation for those who are the most affected, especially the indigenous peoples and local communities, and they haven't. And even this year, a couple of months ago, there was a group of indigenous leaders, and together with representatives of Brazilian civil society, coming and is still stressing that the way it is, and the way the discussions are going on, these won't address and might even increase the risks for forests and also for local communities and indigenous peoples. So I don't know what will be the reaction from Lula. We know that there are discussions. Lula, we need to bear in mind that Lula wants to gain further support from agribusiness. Agribusiness, a significant part of the major stakeholders during the election, even in the elections in 2018, they supported Bolsonaro. A lot of them supported Bolsonaro in the election last year, and they are still backing all these proposals that would represent a severe setback. And Lula wants to gain some support there, political support there. And the trade agreement might be a way of that. And so there's a pressure over him to move forward. However, I see a representative from Brazilian embassy not agreeing with me, but I'm sorry. But yes, this is my reading. That is this huge pressure, and then we don't know what's going to happen next. But my recommendation for the inclusion and the consultation is there.
Ja, ich meine, das ist auf jeden Fall auch das, was wir sehr oft hören.
This is definitely something that we hear a lot on the ground, that the civil society does not feel included. And this is definitely a task for the Brazilian administration or the administrations of the different Mercosur countries. And the question of how or why Lula wants this treaty to be reopened is an interesting one, because the agribusiness is breathing down his neck. And then, of course, he wants to have a good agreement. Of course, we cannot have a look into his head, but there's different theses. Mr. Holterhuis, I would like to ask you later on, sorry about that, we would like to open the floor to see if we have any questions from the audience or short comments. Please no lectures, but please briefly present yourself and tell us if you have a question or if you see something differently as how it was discussed here on the panel. Just keep it brief in order for us to have the possibility to ask many people. We have a question back here in the room. Good morning, Bettina Müller from PowerShift. Thank you so much for this very interesting panel. I have two comments/questions. A short comment with a question on top of it. So I would like to address them to Ms. Brandner. First of all, you were saying that Lula is really committed to forest protection. We would like to protect him. And this is something that, of course, we support at the civil society. But Mercosur is not only Brazil. There are 3 other countries where the issue deforestation is playing an important role. So the Amazon is not the only one. El Gran Chaco has higher deforestation rates in Argentina as compared to the Amazon forest. So how would you like to guarantee, together with the administration there, we had elections in Argentina and in Paraguay. We have a very conservative administration that has been repeated. And you were referring to soy once and again. And I would like to clarify one thing. We can provide materials from PowerShift because we have worked with soy a lot. Soy is tariff-free, yes, but soy oil is not. And Paraguay is working intensively in the extension of the soy oil production, and 10% tariff is on that oil that would disappear with the treaty. So to say that it would not have any impact on the soy production is not right. Maybe not in Brazil to that extent, but yes, in Argentina with those export tariffs and in Paraguay. Second question, value creation. I think it's a good idea that you would like to support those countries, but it's not only about forest protection and forest degradation, but the industrialization that goes along with it. One of those reasons why Lula said, okay, we cannot fully support it because when it comes to public procurement, we would like to negotiate further. Short question. So how would you like to assure, since we have an impact on the automotive sector, that the economy would reduce? How would you create value? I don't really understand that. 2 quite complex questions. I would like to forward them directly. I don't think it's a good idea to collect the question because it would become too much. So, Franziska, whenever you're ready. Thank you so much for your questions, Ms. Müller. Yes, of course, the treaty applies to all the different countries and not only to Brazil. There are 3 other countries as well. And Argentina is getting closer to the elections. They're in a difficult situation. And those who are following up on the news on the region know it. It is quite hurtful because I have lived in Argentina for a while and have good friends there, and it's quite worrying. I hope that it will go through. Who knows what the outcome of those elections are going to be. We'll not talk about preferences here, but I think this is why the situation is not an easy one now in Argentina. It's a very unstable situation. We simply have to look towards the election results. Paraguay just celebrated elections, and we don't really have an administration that has the same ambition like Lula. This has to be stated, but the rules have to apply to all the 4 countries, of course. And yes, Argentina does impose export tariffs on parts of their agricultural products. The question is, Argentina exports a lot in the meat sector. So if we were to open up those negotiations, I tell you frankly, then we will not have less meat, but more meat. So I think this is something that we have to be quite clear about. So when we talk about it, there's more pressure on us taking up more meat and not less. So if we look towards negotiations, there is some frustration on the Mercosur states saying that we're not able to export sufficiently. And Annie, you said so. So there's no pressure on having less exports. So whenever we touch upon that part, then I think realistically speaking, we have to assess where the journey is going. When it comes to soy oil, and this has to be looked upon in a differentiated manner. So what are those products that are exempt from taxes or from tariffs? And not all the products are exempt, so it's quite technical when you look at the tariffs list. And then you were talking about value creation in the countries. In the automotive industry, the situation is such that we have a huge presence of German brands in those countries. So Brazil, it's Volkswagen. I think they're quite proud on having this large standing presence in Brazil, in how well they're included in the society and what an important actor they are. So we do not think that the German industry will stop producing on the ground. So there are no signs that we will have less value creation in the country. They have been there for quite a while. So one could be criticizing that we don't have sufficient electrical vehicles being produced. So it's always about the chicken-egg question. So whenever you start producing, maybe there's more pressure that we have a sufficiently well-working charging infrastructure. So this is something that we could discuss further on for what is produced in the countries. And when it comes to the raw materials, to the commodities, I think it's relevant because further processing of the raw materials, let's say it's always more expensive doing the further processing in the country as compared to China, because, of course, they have different standards. So the question is of how we can balance it with mechanisms like dual pricing that facilitate or make it even possible that further processing can stand up to the competition with Asian countries. And this is something that we have tried to facilitate with Chile and the Brazilian, Argentinian side that are relevant for raw materials. They would like to, and I do understand that, they would like to have a similar outcome as compared to Chile in order to facilitate further processing in the country. I think this is quite justified, where they say, okay, of course you have to help us, that it makes sense to keep the processing step in the country, that we have investors coming into the country, and that it does make sense to keep it in the country. And this is something that we have to talk about in negotiations. And this is a question on value creation that we can facilitate or make it more difficult. And of course, we would like to facilitate it, no doubt whatsoever. Are there any further questions?
Thank you very much. Here in the front. Hello, my name is Elke Mannike. I'm from the Tropical Woods Foundation, or where we work together with small organizations in the country of the tropical rainforest. And for us, it's very important to talk to the civil society and work with civil society in the respective countries and support them, because especially when it comes to government changes, as in Brazil, for example, a strong civil society is very important. So this is why we think that an independent monitoring or also a complaint mechanism for civil society is very, very important from our point of view to have an effective forest protection. I would like to ask a question. Ms. Brandner, you said that it's very important that rainforest products can make it more easily to the European market. But I would like to go one step further. So products that promote biodiversity, that come from small-scale farming, that go beyond that, I think it's very important to provide easier access to them. And my question would be to Mr. Rittel or Mr. Holterhuis, whether this agreement would allow for that, or what is necessary in order to allow for that. Thank you very much. Maybe we can go to Mr. Holterhuis immediately and talk about the question, what is actually the role of civil society currently and also in your model? So, I mean, also in the current sustainability chapter, there is a body that is actually representing civil society. So maybe you can explain this very briefly, what the role of civil society is, and how about your model? Well, in fact, briefly, coming back to Ms. Brandner, because you said GSP Plus, that we have similar incentive systems. This is correct, but only unilaterally. So there are no bilateral incentive mechanisms. And I think that this is very important to emphasize this, that there's a difference, because it's very important whether you agree on something together, what the standards are, or whether the standards are laid out unilaterally. And GSP Plus is a good instrument, of course. The EU says that we give to certain threshold countries and development countries reduced tariffs or specific contingents when certain human rights agreements and environmental agreements are signed. This is a good incentive system, but it is still a unilateral system. And there is the sanctions regime, like the forest protection agreement, which says, again, well, if you do not act as we wish, then your products will not reach our markets. I mean, both are very important instruments, but I do think that for the acceptance, it would be much better to say all sides agree on one mechanism. Well, this is quite clear. I just said that the basic idea is that we give incentives to act. This is quite old. I mean, this is nothing new. And so this is why I said that currently we have very many unilateral instruments, and the offer to the Mercosur side would be to turn this into a bilateral or multilateral instrument. And of course, at the moment, I mean, this is still a very unilateral approach. Of course, we can still discuss that with countries. There might be exceptions when it comes to the deforestation regulation, but when we have the forest protection mechanism for the Mercosur, then of course the other would not apply. Well, of course, and we would also run into difficulties with the WTO when it comes to the forest protection regulation, etc. But this is a different topic and should be discussed elsewhere. And GATT, okay, yeah, that's an even more difficult topic and should be discussed elsewhere. Well, coming back to the civil society, the current debate when it comes to the sustainability chapter is about consultation. So going away from the strict regulations that we know from the trade other trade agreements or provisions. And the instrument that I proposed, basically, and as I said, it's only a proposal, and politics can do whatever it likes with it, but this incentive system, and that's when I do see the problem that we should give something now and not in the future, or maybe in the middle, and combine it. But irrespective of that, and I would like to simplify it, I would recommend a Forest Protection Council which continuously evaluates whether the objectives that have been agreed upon have been kept in order to launch the incentives, and then explicitly also to include actors that are relevant in civil society and which might part or should be part of this independent body. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we have to come to an end because we are already running out of time. Carlos Ritter, once again, the question regarding the sustainable products that are in line with the protection of the forest. So how do you see it? Should these products come or get easier access to the EU from the Mercosur? What is your take on that?
Yes, if they fulfill the right standards, the problem is that we still don't have the right standards in place. As part of the agreement, even the new EU regulation, as Anna's referred to, it doesn't include other wooded lands, as the Brazilian savannas, the cerrados, and so the soil expansion is happening there. Deforestation is happening there faster than it happened, even in several years, faster than it happens in the Amazon, and so this is very important. And if may, I just make a very brief comment on civil society. Among the setbacks, among the risks that we are having in Brazil right now, the same Congress that has been pushing for the environmental setbacks in Brazilian legislation has approved a parliamentary inquiry commission to investigate NGOs working in the Amazon. This is harassment, pure harassment. To withdraw the attention, the force, the resource, because they need to pay lawyers to defend them in the National Congress. This is happening in spite of the fact that we have the conversation between the two blocks. And I think this is very important to bear in mind that there's huge risk beyond the environmental risk that we have. Civil society spaces also can be shrinking, and then the same guys who are pushing for those environmental setbacks are there threatening the civil society to work.
Ja, vielen Dank nochmal für das Plädoyer.
Thank you very much for this plea. I think this is actually also a task for all of us. We should continue to strengthen considerably the civil society on the ground and show solidarity, as we already did under the Bolsonaro government. So thank you very much. I think the question has already been answered. No, maybe just one question. One remark to you. I mean, we could change this because these products are not part of the trade nomenclatura as we would like to have it. I mean, if we had a legally binding additional instrument, so we would also like to see a layout of the tariffs here. But of course, we need a legal change. So currently, the sustainable rainforest products, and I'm not talking about the Amazon region, we are usually also talking about virgin forests. So it's forests in general, not only the Amazon region. In Germany, people tend to talk about the Amazon, but it's rainforests everywhere, so it's a comprehensive approach, and this also applies to the EU because we also have virgin forests here, not in Germany, but within the EU. So thank you very much for the great panel, the perspective of the federal government and the scientific perspective. How do we assess the status quo and what else can we do in order to make our trade policy more sustainable, and also the insights from Brazil and the Brazilian discussions. So unfortunately, we've come to the end of the first panel, and now I'd like to pass the floor to Martin Häusling, and maybe a short incentive. Afterwards, we will stay here. There will be some snacks. We will have the opportunity to talk bilaterally. So please stay here. During the second panel, we will talk about the agroecology and the agribusiness. Thank you.
Ja, genau. Ich nutze schon mal hier diese kurze Umbauphase, um direkt die...
I'm now using this short period in between the sessions in order to introduce the panelists, but I will wait for another second until the noise dies down a little bit. So, I would like to welcome Martin Häusling. I already welcomed him earlier, but I would like to briefly introduce him. He's the agricultural policy spokesperson of the Greens in the European Parliament, and he's also a member of the Environment Committee, and he is a farmer himself. He has an ecological farm with cheese production. He's an agricultural technician, so he's really an expert on these questions. So thank you very much for being here and participating in the discussion. Then I would also like to ask Ms. Ophelia Nick to come to the stage. Ms. Nick is Parliamentary State Secretary at the Federal Ministry of Food and Agriculture, the EMEL. She is a veterinarian, and she has been also the spokesperson of the BAG Agriculture of the Greens before she entered the Parliament in 2021. Thank you very much for participating in the discussion. And the other two panelists have already taken seat. Great. We have Antonio Andrioli. Antonio built up the University Fronteira Sul, and he was the vice president and also an expert in agroecology. So Antonio is our agroecology expert here. He is currently a guest professor at the University of Hamburg, and his main focus is on the growing of GM soy in Brazil and the social and ecological impact on small-scale farmers. So I think soy will also be a very strong focus in the second panel as well. And last but not least, we have Liz Cunha. She's a trade expert from Greenpeace, and she has been a parliamentarian assistant with the Greens in the European Parliament. She studied sociology and human rights law in Hamburg and in London, and I'm quite happy that you're also here on this panel. Well, we will start with a video statement from Maceo Gomes. Maceo Gomes is a representative of the Brazilian NGO Reporter Brazil, an organization of which I have read many interesting contributions. Reporter Brazil was founded by Brazilian journalists, and they set up documentaries about the human rights situation in Brazil, especially about modern forms of slavery very often, but also indigenous rights. And now we will hear his critical remarks on the EU-Mercosur agreement in English once again. So should you need a translation, please get a receiver.
There is a new administration in Brazil. The president now is Lula da Silva, but a relevant part of the Brazilian parliament remains closely identified with the agenda of the former president. That means proposals to open indigenous peoples' territories to mineral and agricultural exploitation remains in place, as well as bills to interrupt the land reform program and to incentive the use of pesticides. For all these reasons, it's not an exaggeration to say that the Brazilian government itself has contributed to boost land conflicts, attacks on indigenous people's rights, and illegal deforestation in protected biomes. Although we recognize that there is a huge effort by President Lula to take the country in another direction. Anyway, there are doubts about the potential socio-environmental and labor risks represented by the association agreement between European Union and Mercosur. In the chapter on trade and sustainable development, signatory countries must pursue the objectives of the Paris Agreement and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change to curb global warming. Also mentions the need for the parties to the agreement to make efforts at forest preservation in line with the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. The same chapter stresses the importance of consulting local communities and indigenous people for enhancing their livelihoods and to promoting the conservation and sustainable use of forests. Also, it addressed the control of supply chains, considering the guidelines contained in International Labour Organization frameworks and the guiding principles on business and human rights. However, there are fundamental gaps that cast doubts on signatory countries' actual ability to meet these targets. Most of the provisions are not legally binding or too vague and mainly aspirational. An effective enforcement and sanctions mechanism is lacking. Without clear tools for implementing and controlling socio-environmental public policies, and without effective instruments to sanction in case of irregularities, the treaty will be limited to good intentions. I can give you an example on the beef industry. Historically, the main source of slave labor and driver of deforestation in the Amazon. Although the agreement recommends the exchange of information between European Union and Mercosur, it does not detail how this exchange should happen in practice. In the Brazilian case, there is even a database, SISBOV, maintained by the federal government in order to monitor the transit of bovine and bovine cattle across the country. However, In addition to not providing information in a public and accessible way, the system has mainly sanitary control purpose. In other words, SysBOV database does not yet include references to illegal deforestation, exploitation of slave labor, or violation of the rights of indigenous people. Therefore, it does not meet the sustainability targets set by the European Union and Mercosur Association Agreement. I will finish emphasizing that the treaty does not provide for legally binding obligations for companies and sanctions to be applied to companies involved in possible social environmental damages caused by their suppliers. Also, the agreement does not hold European companies accountable in their countries of origin.
Ja, ganz vielen Dank hier auch auf die Distanz.
Thank you very much also to Marcel Gomez for these clear words, also with regard to the lacking sanctions mechanisms when it comes to legal violations. I would like to open up the discussion with a question to Martin Häusling. I will call him Martin because we've known each other for quite a long time. So, Martin, you've mentioned it earlier. So, you have been to Brazil, you know the context in Argentina. And I would like to know at the beginning, how is the agricultural model in Argentina connected to the European agricultural model? And how would be the impact of an EU-Mercosur agreement? Well, I have to say that I also went to Paraguay. Paraguay is often forgotten. We always talk about Brazil, but when I look at the other three countries, then it's almost the size of the European Union, so we could not simply neglect it. And in Paraguay, for example, since 1945, one party has been ruling, the Colorado Party. For 2 years, there was a left government which was toppled. So Brazil is more or less democratic. I would like to say more or less because I think that the government does not have really an impact on the individual federal states because there still Bolsonaro fans are governing. But Paraguay is a state, from my point of view, which is really, really difficult, to put it mildly. Uruguay is also has a right-wing government, and Argentina. Also, to make it very clear, and I mean, very many people talk only about the Brazilian rainforest, but the Gran Chaco and the Genaro are the biggest spots of deforestation in Argentina, and nobody's talking about it. In both countries, we see massive deforestation for soy plantations. And this brings me to the topic because the European agricultural lobby is uttering a voice against the Mercosur, of course, who is a fan of beef imports here. But no one of the European agricultural lobbyists is saying anything about the imports of soy. Why not? Because this is massively used in animal husbandry. So, of course, they do not want to give it up. So they want to have GM soy on the European market, also milk, in order to support their livestock. And this is quite a strange situation because in both countries, in Brazil and Argentina, the small-scale farmers are the most afraid of this agreement because they say that this agreement is only in favor of the large-scale producers, but there's a large number of small-scale farmers in Brazil, and they are actually afraid of European dairy products. So, yes, the agricultural industry is very interested in this agreement. They do want to expand their exports. And of course, the 100,000 tons of beef is way too little from their point of view. Well, yes, if we would renegotiate, then of course there would be a demand to increase this. And it's just 1% of the European market, but 1% can already be too high to actually make the market explode. But on the other hand, we do not talk about another thing, which has already been mentioned earlier. Agrofuels are a very important part of this agreement. So when it comes to European sustainable automotive car mobility is being actually run on Brazilian agrofuels. I mean, we should not hide that. We should not conceal that. It's not only about beef or soy. It's also about agricultural fuels. And this is a chapter that we should take a closer look at.
And I do think that the problem with this agreement is that this is an agreement of not the last century, but the last millennium. So we have done some cosmetical changes, and then we said, okay, now it's that. And I do understand an argument that's been mentioned before. Europe needs new friends. And Europe would like to be in contact with those countries that will be the basis of our raw material supply. But I think we would have to think a bit further if we want to have new friends, if this old and obsolete agreement can really serve as a basis for our sustainable standards according to the Paris Agreement. This is not the case. So this is put on as an annex, but it doesn't really have any implications whatsoever, it's been said. So my balance is that it does not really make any difference. It does not make a difference. It doesn't really do any damage. So if we were to do a sustainable agreement, it's not sufficient what the EU Commission wanted to add. Then we might have the possibility to conclude a new agreement. But this is not what that one is that we have on the table. Thank you so much for the classification from our EU perspective. Ms. Nick, I would like to ask you, you are in the Federal Ministry for Nutrition and Agriculture, so you're quite closely in contact with other farmers on the European level. So what are their worries when we consider the European side? Good morning to all of you. Thank you for having me. When it comes to Mercosur, all the different farmers associations agree. They say we don't want to have those products like in the sensitive areas like milk, like beef. Of course, they don't want to have that competition because this is where they're all affected. So they do all agree. And then, of course, they all do agree that try to become more active in China for more pork meat exports. So this is not the way this world works. And I think it is an issue that we have to discuss thoroughly. But if we were to look on the situation on the globe, and it is a very important situation now, looking that Russia and China get closer to one another, then Europe has to think about who we form or forge our alliances with. So I don't know if we have to talk about friends, but of course we have to diversify our trade. And we've all seen that this is important. This is why Mercosur has gained importance. So this is like a logical outcome that we have to strive for. Of course, it has to be improved, but we from the Ministry for Agriculture, we say it is worrying to open it up again. The way that Franziska Brandner put it, it might become more difficult. So we try to work with this additional agreement. But maybe not only look towards Mercosur, but all those other treaties that we're doing. So then we try to launch a new project with Brazil where we consider rights of indigenous communities. I hope this is something that will work out next year, that we have a coalition of agriculture, that we come together with the Federal Ministry for Development. So we have all those issues, Paris, all those projects that go independently of Mercosur agreement. And I do think that with the help of the treaty and the additional agreements, we will be able to have improvements in terms of human rights, in terms of the environment. This should be our goal, and therefore I think it's really important to come together here today.
Nachher noch mal zurückkommen auf.
So I would like to get back to you later, but would now like to finish off the round. Liz Cunha, you're working in Greenpeace. Greenpeace has looked into exotic fruits for the second time in order to see residual levels of pesticides that are not approved of in Europe. I think it has been limes from Brazil that have been evaluated. So how would the pesticide industry benefit from the treaty, and what consequences would an increased pesticide trade have for the environment, both sides of the Atlantic? Good morning. There are many different problematic aspects in the treaty. We've heard about a few, and pesticides is a huge issue because the treaty foresees that tariffs on pesticide exports to South America are to be lowered. So when we have a chemical group like Bayer or BASF, whenever they export pesticides to South America, like glyphosate, then this consortium has to pay up to 14% of tariffs, and this is done away by the agreement. So it's a huge incentive for increased trade with pesticides, and this comes in a time where we would like to reduce the use of pesticides. This is one of our main objectives, and therefore is a huge discrepancy that we see in the treaty where the use of pesticides is incentivized in other parts of the world. And you mentioned it, the impact on the environment and on the communities on the ground, they are massive. In Brazil, pesticides are sprayed on the crops from the air, so they can travel with the air up to 1,000 kilometers, and those pesticides contaminate soil and water. They decrease biodiversity. We all know the example from our bees, and this, of course, leads to health issues with those communities that live all around those crops. And my colleagues in Brazil are committed to work together with the communities for many years in order to reduce pesticide use and to try to incentivize alternatives. And they're really worried because they know that with the treaty, the agribusiness is strengthened, not the alternatives, but the agribusiness. And all those battles that they're fighting on the ground, taking into consideration that the situation is already difficult, all those health issues, this will be aggravated by the incentivized trade with pesticides. And you mentioned it, the negative outcomes of pesticide trade will not only be felt in South America, but we will receive those residual levels of pesticides in our fruit here in Europe. We have bought lime in 8 different EU countries and have looked into the pesticide residues, and it has been shown that it does not really matter where you order a caipirinha in Europe. We have a high possibility that it will be full of pesticides. So from 52 samples, only 1 did not show any residual levels. And in a few samples, we had 7 different substances in one lime, and we don't really know about the consequences of that. We don't really know what this really means for our health if we consume so many different substances at the same time. So it's really worrying to look at the treaty from this perspective. It will have an impact on South America, but as well on our consumers here in Europe. And what's usually not considered, that import controls are to be lowered. So the treaty says that the controls on imported products will be lowered in volume. So the possibility that we will have more pesticides in the products that we consume is really increasing. So if we're really talking seriously about a social ecological transformation or the protection of our environment and biodiversity, then it cannot sign a treaty that includes those incentives. It simply does not go together. And nobody was able to explain me so far of how this additional instrument can do away with all those worries. This is why we would like to see new negotiations on the basis of a sustainable approach. Thank you so much, Liz, for those results and assessments. And before I hand over to you, Antonio, just a short question. When it's about pesticide trade and those double standards, what are those pesticides that can be exported to countries and can be used in those countries when they're not approved of here in Europe? So we have efforts in the ministry here in Germany, but as well on the EU level. So maybe you can briefly react on that or explain what those endeavors of the EU and the federal ministry are. Yeah, I do see the goodwill, but nothing really happens. Definitely nothing happens. There's a huge interest of the European chemical industry to keep on delivering, but it is a really nonsense. I mean, from the health issues, then we ban those pesticides here and then we re-import them from other countries. So it comes back to us. I mean, it's just nonsense. So we only have letters of intent that we've seen. In Germany, I think all those three parties in the coalition, not really an easy issue. So we have proposed the legislative draft so that we do not want to re-import what is banned here because of health issues. And this is in the department, in the voting process. And we think it's really usually interesting or important because it does not make any sense whatsoever. And then, of course, we have clear rules independently of Mercosur to control our imports, and we have our sanitary and phytosanitary measures, and this has to be improved independently of Mercosur. And I do admit I do receive a lot of questions about the maximum residual level in our products. This is daily business, but independently of the Mercosur, we really have to look into not reducing biodiversity, but all the difference. So if we reopen it all the way, then we think it will not become better, but we will have to include all these additional agreements, because those additional agreements that are on the table, we don't know them fully. Maybe just a short reaction. It's not independent of the Mercosur Treaty because it will reduce the controls on imported goods. So it is definitely something that has to do with the Mercosur agreement. So on the EU level, the EU Commission has committed to launch an import ban on hazardous chemicals that are banned in the EU, among them pesticides. But if until the end of the year we will have a proposal of the Commission on the table, then chances are not really high that this will go through until the next election. Antonio, you would surely like to react on the pesticides issue, and then afterwards I would like to ask you if you could express yourself a bit more solution-oriented, since you're one of the experts of agroecology. So how would a policy have to look like that really has a good outcome? Thank you so much for the invitation and for me to have the possibility to talk optimistically. At least I hope I will be able to do that. Agroecology means that we do not need any pesticides whatsoever. But I would not only bet on the exports of agroecological products, because we would like to reduce longer distances, longer transport distances. So if we were in the situation to produce without pesticides, and this happened for millennium, so this is nothing new. The new thing is the use of pesticides and the ever-increased use of pesticides. So it would be important to see how much does the EU invest, or the German administration invests in agroecology, how much research is taking place in this country in order for the farmers being able to produce without the use of pesticides. I think this would be an important signal for us if the EU was to launch something like that. As an example, since we're so conscious with the environment, so many people then don't want to have the pesticides, then why not invest in research? It would be a good sign for us as researchers and scientists in Brazil if we were to foster scientific centers like which has been done in Africa. And I would really like to see if the Federal Ministry for Development would really take a chance and invest in agroecology, and not only in South American countries, but the way around. I think it's quite critical if we were to produce without pesticides. This is our ultimate objective. And if we're not there, then at least we should stop pesticide exports. If they're not allowed in the country, then why not impose taxes on the use of pesticides? And so what is it all about in this agreement? To do away with tariffs. So this is the opposite of what we need. And I think it's really important to say, oh, we want to support Lula. And we know Lula. He's become a lot better than as compared to 20 years ago. Environmental policy of indigenous communities, at least what he says in the media. It is a huge progress, but is not a monolithic block. And it only becomes worse. With the parliament, with the Congress, if we have a pressure that this administration should have more ministers that do not pursue the same goals that Lula has announced. So we have to see that such an agreement changes the power relations in the country, in Brazil, to a direction where exactly what we would like to avoid is strengthened, and that Lula finds himself in exactly that trap that he found himself in a few years ago. So the first administrations were the huge alliances with the big agribusiness owners. So I think we should move away from monocultures. We should move away from agricultural business. So this might be the next problem that we face in the EU. And it can all be included in the same concept of the free trade agreement that we think by doing away with tariffs, agriculture can be moved into a different direction. I would rather assume that if we do not have this treaty, then we cause less damage. It causes less damage. In order to get closer to our ultimate goal, to fight hunger, to have environmental protection and agroecology. And this is why I think it's really important to say that this agreement, the way we have it on the table right now, should be stopped altogether, because in terms of contents, nothing really changed. And the only argument that is applicable that in that situation we could negotiate with Lula, this does not apply anymore. It has become obvious that the Mercosur agreement only strengthened those forces in the administration that try to put pressure on Lula, that we have a majority in the Congress like never before. And in the society, that should be mentioned, we do have our reactions. Agroecology cannot be implemented in Brazil without having to work together with Via Campesina. And the Via Campesina has a quite outspoken document on it. We cannot contribute to the reducing of deforestation if the most important actors of the indigenous communities are not on the table. So the hugest association of the indigenous communities has a position, and those are the stakeholders that have to be strengthened. And we have to strengthen rightly those forces in the administration that go along with our objectives. And we should not please those agribusiness owners with the lowering of tariffs. And this is exactly what the agreement says. And I don't see that this should become different with an additional document. So if we have hazardous products that are exported free of tariffs, and we can only expect that results will not be in accordance with our goals. So, because of foreign policy reasons, I do not understand that an agreement with those countries will contribute to a more peaceful and more ecological world, because the actors that are active on the ground and those actors that want the Mercosur agreement are not those actors that would like to comply with the climate goals. And this is quite important to see. But the agricultural products have been announced quite clearly. In this administration, we have a state secretary. We have programs for school menus, and this is where we should see of how to start out. And the German government can do that. And I think the EU Commission should take that on. Thank you, Antonio, for those quite clear words. And I've seen that Ophelia, Nick, and Martin Häusling wanted to react on that. They would like to open the floor for questions. I think there's a lot of expertise in the room, and then surely many questions.
Well, whether the Mercosur agreement improves the ecological or agricultural situation needs to be seen. And there is no one who says it's going to improve the situation considerably. But when we look at the current world situation, where do we see wars, where do we see powers coming together, then it's very important that Europe comes together with those countries who are, at least as their basis, democratic. And I mean, we see Russia and China are cooperating on the other side. And of course, we should not only look at the perspective of the agriculture. But when we discuss Mercosur only from an agricultural perspective, then we should have a different discussion. So we should see it all in context. So this is why it's so important that the products and the exchange upon Mercosur remains not only focused on agriculture. I mean, you already heard about small-scale farming and possible competition. I mean, we want to reduce controls, but in the EU and in Germany, we have clear guidelines that we want to maintain. And we cannot allow for any changes here because our consumers would not go along with that. But on the other hand, we also have to see that and acknowledge that all the things that we want as Greens on sustainable use regulation, for example, or the reduction of utilization of pesticides by 2030, that this is really a difficult discussion to have and that we are far from being successful. It will be very difficult to achieve a success here. When it comes to agro-business, or agricultural ecology, rather, is very important, and we are trying to make headway here. So we have clear plans, and we are now setting aside 30% of the research funding to ecological farming. So there are very many projects in order to go towards a circular economy. And I'm telling this to all the countries I'm talking to, be it African countries, Central Asia, countries there. All governments need to have a good circular economy. They need to have regional and stable value creation chains. And this holds true for Brazil as well. And this is why I also talked to the Brazilian State Secretary that we are going to support her when it comes to the nutritional councils and school meals. And all these are very important topics that we want to make progress on, irrespectively of Mercosur, because we do believe that this will be the solution eventually. However, the headwind is quite strong, and this is not really the majority, or this is not what the majority actually would like to see. Well, talking about headwind, I mean, many people might have seen that the European Union is lowering its regulations. So the Conservatives are destroying the nature conservation law. So we are demanding others to protect nature, but we are not doing the same thing in our agricultural sector. We are also liberalizing our GMO law. So we are not providing a good benchmarks here, and it's quite difficult when the Europeans go to other countries and say, well, you've got to protect your natural resources or your rainforest, but we are not protecting ours, for example, in Romania or so. So we should not act as if we were going to save the world, but we are not going to protect our environment at home. So this is very important that the EU sets the right standards. Otherwise, we are not credible. We are not trustworthy, and we aren't at the moment when it comes to the discussions with other countries. And what I wanted to say as well is that the Deforestation-Free Supply Chain Act is one of those laws where we can say, well, this is really an advantage. But I've been to the Serrano for quite some time. I mean, there are no state controls. Sorry. I mean, there is an illegal logging and a legal logging. When it comes to the legal logging, 20% of the forest needs to remain intact. Okay, so there's some spots left. But in these federal states or these regions, there's no state control. So if we want to set standards, then of course we would also have to say how we want to implement it. And the utilization of pesticides in Brazil, well, okay. I mean, when we want to help the Brazilians, we have to enable them, what Lula needs to do now. I mean, Bolsonaro destroyed the whole environmental authorities, and there we need to provide support. I mean, Brazil, under Lula, there was an environmental control or monitor, and we need to provide support in this regard. This is something that we can do as Europeans. And coming back to the global aspect, well, usually people tend to say, well, if we don't do it, the Chinese will go there. But the Chinese are already there. They're building railway lines, the electricity grid. So, no, it's not that if we don't do it, the Chinese will go there. I visited one of the big soy companies who produce soy oil, and the Europeans go there with their sustainability standards. But they say, okay, we can do that for Europe, but the largest part will go to China anyway. So to open up the whole agreement, I think we both agree on that, would be very risky on the one hand, but to act as if this agreement would lead to new environmental standards is complete rubbish. But nevertheless, we should face up to the realities, and France, for example, is still trying to work against it, but Macron has changed his views so many times already that we'll have to wait and see. But from the European Parliament, we have to exert some pressure that the additional instruments really have an impact and are not only nice words on a paper. So I think this will be our main task in the European Parliament now. And Germany, of course, can also make a contribution to make progress here, because the German voice in the Council makes clear that we have to do more than just track whether the automotive industry in Germany is doing well. I mean, this cannot be the benchmark. Well, thank you very much. I would like to emphasize once again, in order not to forget this aspect, that the school meal programs, etc., was mentioned, and the nutritional aspect is also very important in the Mercosur agreement. I mean, this has been neglected under Bolsonaro. We are not only talking about environmental impact, but also social impact. So how can regional trade projects such as the school meal projects or the support for small-scale farmers that are incorporated in these projects, how we can strengthen these structures? And now I would like to open up the discussion. Of course, we're also running out of time, but I would like to give you the floor for a few questions. So please raise your hand if you have a question. Yes, in the front row, we've got a first question. Please also say the panelist you are directing the question to. It is directed at Ophelia Nick. My name is Mara. I'm working here at the foundation, and it's rather a comment with regard to the narrative by which the Mercosur agreement is sold as desirable. And I've heard, on the one hand, that we are conducting very many other projects in which the rights of indigenous people or food safety, etc., is being promoted. Because we can have other projects, we can agree on Mercosur, but I think this is not a good argumentation. I mean, this is not really conclusive. You cannot simply say, well, we're doing this and that on the one hand in order to provide more protection. So on the other hand, we can implement Mercosur with all the room for criticism that we've already heard. And the other aspect is, yes, we see power shifts on the international level, China and Russia. This is quite a frequent argument. And as China and Russia are on the forefront, we now have to come together with other democracies or come closer to other democracies. So why is Mercosur as an agreement which, first of all, does not include civil society groups, for example, Via Campesina, why is this actually considered a democratic rapprochement between Europe and Latin American countries. So I would like to question this narrative, and I would like to hear an answer. Well, yes, of course, but I would like to collect another question. Are there any further questions?
Ich gucke mal, ob sich noch jemand anderes meldet, Bettina. Ja, hier.
I'm looking around. So here in the forefront, there's another question.
Ja, hier Moritz Tapp aus dem Bundesvorstand.
Moritz Tapp from the BUND Youth Board. I think in the two panels we have heard quite a lot already. The indigenous initiatives, the NGOs on the ground, they are severely under pressure also under the Lula government. They are not pro-Mercosur, and we have heard about the human rights and sanitary or health issues when it comes to pesticides, and also the increase of pesticides exports through Mercosur. And we also heard about the EU Parliament and the local actions of the EVP. And we heard that the only solution would be to implement Mercosur by an amendment in order to achieve improvement when it comes to human rights, environmental and climate due diligence regulations. And my question is, in how far is this a realistic option when it comes to the current situation in Brussels and Strasbourg? Is it possible at all? And should we not rather focus our resources on, as Mr. Andrioli has already mentioned, on research projects or first pilot projects in the agro-eco business in order to facilitate these projects? Because in view of the current situation and the facts and positions that we have heard also from civil society on this podium today would make much more sense. And my question goes to Ophelia Nick. In how far does this have any opportunity at all at this point? And shouldn't we focus our resources on other areas, human rights and the protection of the forest in the Mercosur states? Thank you. Well, these were many questions to Dr. Nick. I think he can react now, on the one hand, to the narrative and the contradictions, and now the opportunities. Well, I think your question already comprised the answer. I mean, it's no longer the question whether we can still prevent Mercosur, but the question is, can we do it, and where do we focus our resources? And I fully share your view. We have to make sure that we have eco agriculture, and also when it comes to our nutritional strategy, and also in Germany, which is a completely new approach to the agricultural business. So I always tend to tell people, well, look at what ends up on your plate. This really plays a major role, and we should focus on that. I do agree that the narrative is doubtful, and I am looking at it with many doubts as well. So from a farming perspective, I was always against Mercosur. And of course, there are not really arguments in favor of Mercosur. Of course, we can reduce imports, we can make sure that we're good when it comes to pesticide controls. But from an agricultural business point of view, we cannot be in favor of more trade. I mean, there are always products that we cannot produce here, and there, of course, we need a free world trade. But it's very important that we produce regional products everywhere in the world. And of course, it will be to the disadvantage of all countries if they don't do it, be it the US. During COVID-19, the people were starving because they did not have stable local value creation chains. The same holds true for Brazil. I mean, we still have relatively stable supply chains, and we see difficulties when it comes to medicinal drug production. But so we are putting a lot of money into it. We want to do this together with other countries, and we also support the civil society discussions at the FAO or in Rome, who are the second biggest donors. And this is very important from my point of view. We have to include civil society. They need to be at the table when it comes to all the things that we are doing. So I cannot give you a final answer, but I fully agree to the BUND youth. So the organic farming needs to be supported. We have to focus on that, and this is what we are doing, because I think that this will be one of the solutions in order to be able to still live well on this planet over the next centuries. Well, I will accept 2 further questions. Another opportunity. Who would like to ask a question? The 2 of you. Well, thank you very much. Kai Goll. I'm working in the office of Mike Ausendorf, Alliance 90, the Greens in the German Bundestag. And I would like to seize the opportunity for a short plea, basically. Because in both debates, the question came up, is it worth it, or what can we improve, or how can we encourage people in an open discussion? So when we consider the protection of forests as an international challenge, that the EU goes beyond the Amazon Fund and support Lula so that he can implement the 55 objective plan. And in the second panel, we heard about school meals and regional tenders, everything that we can do here. We should not do it apart from the agreement, but we should be courageous enough to connect the 2 things, to stick to our words into both directions. And then back to the coalition agreement, the federal government in Germany agreed on a wording which on the one hand says we will support the agreement, Mercosur agreement, and we want this agreement, and we stand by our commitment. But on the other hand, we take the regulations seriously. They need to be implemented in connection with the agreement. Because at the moment, I just had the impression that to not stand by one's word, but to try to dilute aspects and to overthrow certain parts of the agreement that have long been agreed upon, no matter in which policy field, that we continue to work on that, and this should be our guiding principle. Also, this was in regard to political coherence. I've got another question to Ms. Nick. So we've heard several statements from the ministry, but not very much from the agricultural ministry, even though Robert Habeck also went to the region, and also Cem Özdemir. When it comes to the impact of Mercosur on the agricultural sector, and of course we're also talking about a reduction in tariffs for fruit, vegetables, etc., which are coming from the EU and are exported to the Mercosur countries, highly subsidized, and they're putting at risk small-scale farmers. So will there be an agricultural protective instrument in the future? Well, I'm not sure how this might look like, but basically I've said it several times that we would actually be in favor of that. This is really important. The Brazilian government has put a lot of money into the school food program, school meal program. And of course, we want to support the government in doing so. This is what Cem Özdemir has already mentioned and called windows of opportunity, and Franziska Brandner has already touched upon that. So right now we think that there's a point of time where we have the opportunity to support the Mercosur states in what they have set or laid out as objectives, so more forest protection, etc. So we have a clear stance here, and we say that we want to support this additional agreement, this additional instrument, but we do not want to open up the whole negotiation process as such. So thank you very much. We unfortunately have to come to an end, but I would like to give you a brief concluding remark round, and I would like to start with Antonio and Liz. So what are your take-home messages, or what would you like to tell the representatives of the federal government and the members of parliament for the next weeks and months? How can we come to a relatively good end of this EU-Mercosur process? I'm not sure how the Brazilian-German agricultural dialogue looks like at the moment, because over months we have tried to eventually incorporate civil society. I mean, under these two new governments, because it was formed, the body was formed under the previous government. So how long will it take until the indigenous people, the small-scale farmers, civil society can participate in such a dialogue? And I would not only like to see this for Brazil, but also Paraguay, Argentina, Uruguay. So this is what I would like to see in the future. But what I've seen so far, maybe I have to say, I have to concede that this is an aspect that we have to work on in the future, because it's very interest-driven. If we say both, I mean, we can do both organic farming and Mercosur, but from a factual point of view, it's not possible. And from a factual point of view, there's no coexistence between GM crops and non-GM crop or cultivation. So we cannot do both, as Lula says, or also Marina Silva. We cannot import more beef from Brazil and just assume that it will be all deforestation free. This cannot happen from a factual point of view. So we have to focus on a transitional period, how we can get to organic farming. And this is something that we should focus on and put all our energies. And of course, this cannot be contradiction-free. In politics, nothing can be contradiction-free. But we should stay factual and not turn it around, because I know that specifically what I said is that you are ideological. I mean, when you are in favor of small-scale farmers, etc., you are always said to be ideological. But when you're in favor of large-scale landowners or the agro-business, then you are never ideological. I mean, this is what is being said, but we have to change that. We should come to a transition period where we go over to organic farming, and then we can do many things together in this agro-political dialogues. But we should not forget that the interests that characterize the interests in the agribusiness in Germany, the EU, and also in Brazil are not those forces that are interested in this agreement right now. And I think this should be an admonishment. We should not fall into the trap that we already know. And then we'll no longer be able to get out of it. And then we will no longer have Lula. I mean, Lula will not be president for the next 20 years. Sometimes Lula speaks as if he would govern forever. But Lula is not that young anymore. And what is going to happen if we have such an agreement in 20, 30, or 40 years from now, because one thought that we could have both? But we have to prevent what is being detrimental. We have to protect the insects, the climate, and small-scale farmers need to be protected. And this is what I would like to take home as a shimmer of hope, which I was supposed to actually bring into the discussion at the beginning. So thank you very much, Antonio. And Liz, what would you like to give us as a home message?
Das Abkommen hat kein Ablaufdatum.
I do agree. It does not have any expiration date, this agreement. So I think it's a very long-standing agreement. And I see that the federal government does not have the courage to really try to have new negotiations, and consequently, but for a new negotiation, just greenwashing, where we know that this will not be sufficient. And then I take along and I invite you. We are at we will have a booth on the green space behind this building. This is a gift cocktail, a poisonous cocktail, where we will serve a caipirinha with and you have the organic or the GM version. But if you want to have the organic version, then you have to speak out against the agreement. So you will be served a cocktail in whatever version you would like to have it. So I think it's important that you are really insistent when it is about those important issues. And when it's about agroecology, it is us who are learning. This is not something that we've come up with, but it comes from the Latin American countries, and it's highly interesting. And this is why it should be included in our dialogue. And this is something that I take home, that civil society should be included. We're not really that far. With Brazil, Uruguay, and Colombia, we've gotten a bit further with our expert political dialogue. Then it's really nice because it's a mutual learning experience. So this is something that is like that. But we have to consider, if I talk to agroecologists here in Germany, they don't even know where I am. So organic farming is already very grave. So this is something that we have to try to foster step by step, more circular economy, and all this resilient climate-adjusted agriculture. And this is really quite demanding. So we need all the different hands in here. And agriculture is the only one that makes sense. So this should be our ultimate goal. And for the last concluding words, I would like to hand over to Martin Häusling and would like to tell you just one thing. So you're warmly invited to take a few snacks and the Mercosur will be served as well, and to talk with our panelists. So I would like to thank you. I really have taken home a lot of important messages, and I hope you did so as well. Martin, concluding words. Agroecology, yes, being an organic farmer since 1986, I can only agree, but unfortunately this is not the reality. So I think we have to think beyond Mercosur, because I'm afraid, I don't really know, but I think if the next president in Spain is coming up, and Spain and Portugal are closely intertwined, but not with the indigenous communities, but rather with the administrations. And the Spanish Council presidency said that they would push this one forward. So I don't know if we will be able to organize our majorities against it, but I would like to be frank and open, because we don't have this civil society on board, this debate in the civil society as much as we had it before. And we need to take up dialogue with civil society. This can be done by the government. NGOs are really important. We have to set new examples. But in order to make this clearer, I've traveled to Brazil. So 2 to 3 tons of soy are harvested per hectare, and this is nothing. Then I went to an indigenous community, permaculture, and they really take out several times what the monocultures do, but they're not able to sell it. This is something that we have to support, those initiatives as well. We could set standards, but what we will have to change is our image when it comes to trade agreements. So South America is a huge continent with a lot of different resources. So it's a classical treaty where we want to make sure that those resources are not getting lost. If we're talking about agri-fuels or cattle or rare soils. So but this is not a treaty on eye level, and this is something that we have to change. We, the Europeans, have the obligation to not pursue the neo-colonialist stance, but to really have an agreement on an equal footing. The same applies to the treaty with Chile. I'm part of the Chilean delegation. And with the new treaty with Chile, Francisca is gone already, we basically want to make sure that cheap wine or avocados get into our countries. This, of course, is a catastrophe for organic farming, but since we all like avocados so much, we can easily waste some water on it. So we all have to think about what and how we consume if we want to accept the consequences, and then with the next agreement we can talk about setting different standards. And the civil society has to be motivated to be on board, to think about trade policy and about the role of Europe, and not to think to redo the agreement. But what is the role of Europe in this new world order? We have to say it like that. So how can we make our voices heard and make a difference? And it is quite surprising, if I may say so, that the government in the the Ukraine war is not always on our side, but we have 20 to 30 years of history behind it. We will need the government in the future, and I do agree with you and Franziska that we cannot change the blocks. And when we saw the BRIC talks, I was quite surprised that the Brazilians don't have any conflict with China and Russia, so this worries me quite a bit. I don't really know if Lula's always on the right side, but this is a different discussion. So thank you to the Heinrich-Böll Foundation to facilitate this event. Your competencies in South America, worthwhile mentioning. You have a new office in Argentina that we've really try to foster the exchange. I've really benefited from the Heinrich-Böll Foundation, Brazil, Argentina, and Chile to be on board with the delegation. And I think this is really some of the basis work that you do here in the foundation. So thank you so much for this, and thanks to all of you for joining us.
Dann genau, unten im Erdgeschoss gibt es die Snacks und Getränke.